In the quiet suburbs of Portland, Maine, a violent confrontation ended a decade-long marriage, leaving a community in shock. Mark Williams, a successful businessman, was found standing over the lifeless body of his wife, Katy, after a heated argument. Despite outward appearances of a happy life, Mark's controlling behavior and a secret affair had driven a wedge between the couple. How did a seemingly ordinary marriage unravel into a deadly confrontation? Mark and Katy Williams had been married for over 10 years. They lived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Portland, Maine that seemed perfect for their life together. To outsiders, they were the kind of couple people admired. Mark, a tall, confident man in his mid-40s, worked as a successful businessman. His charm and smooth-talking nature made him popular at both work and social gatherings. Katy, on the other hand, was a devoted homemaker. In her late 30s, she had a soft, kind face that radiated warmth. She spent her days taking care of their home, making sure everything was perfect for Mark when he returned from work. Katy loved cooking, gardening, and creating a cozy, welcoming space for their friends and family. From the outside, their life looked like the classic portrait of a happy, middle-class couple. They had a nice house, attended neighborhood events together, and appeared to enjoy each other's company. But this picture-perfect image hid the real struggles happening behind their closed doors. Mark wasn't just the successful businessman many people admired. He was also a man who needed control in every part of his life, including his marriage. From the very beginning, Mark had clear ideas about how things should be, especially when it came to his wife, Katy. He expected her to fit into the image of the perfect, submissive wife. In his mind, her role was simple: take care of the house, cater to his needs, and always be by his side, smiling and agreeable. Mark had rules for everything. He liked to pick out what Katy wore, commenting on her clothes if they didn't meet his standards. He would make remarks about how she should style her hair, how she should behave at social events, and even how she should speak in public. Over time, his control extended to every detail of their daily lives. He had opinions on what Katy should cook, who she should spend time with, and even how she should spend her free time. For Mark, this was just the way a marriage should work. He believed a good wife should be devoted entirely to her husband, focused on making his life easier and happier. He didn't see anything wrong with it. In fact, he thought Katy was lucky to have a life where she didn't have to worry about anything outside the home. But for Katy, life under Mark's control was suffocating. She had once been a lively, independent woman, but as the years passed, she felt herself shrinking under the weight of his constant demands. Every decision was made for her, every part of her life dictated by what Mark wanted. Slowly, Katy's own desires and needs began to fade into the background. She became a shadow of the person she once was, always putting Mark's needs first, while her own sense of identity slipped away. Such a life was draining for Katy. Though she rarely spoke up or argued, the pressure was building inside her. She often felt isolated, unable to express how trapped she really felt. She longed for a sense of freedom, to make her own choices and live life on her own terms. But she kept these feelings hidden, believing that it was her duty to keep up appearances and maintain the image of a perfect marriage. Katy knew that, in their world, the cost of rebellion might be too high. The more Mark controlled her, the more distant Katy became, and the cracks in their relationship grew wider. Mark Williams, despite his strict control over Katy, did not hold himself to the same standards he expected of his wife. While he demanded loyalty and obedience from Katy, he saw no problem indulging in an affair with his secretary, Lisa. In his mind, this wasn't just a fling. It was another way for him to assert his power and success. Lisa, younger and more easily impressed by Mark's wealth and charm, became his escape from the responsibilities of marriage. For Mark, the affair wasn't about love or emotional connection. It was about feeding his ego and proving to himself that he could have it all. Mark's affair started quietly, behind the scenes. He was careful, but not too careful. In his world, he felt untouchable. Katy, he believed, would never question him. To outsiders, Mark continued to play the role of the devoted husband, attending social events with Katy by his side, while privately sneaking away to spend time with Lisa. For a long time, Katy suspected nothing. She was so caught up in the routine of her controlled life that she didn't notice the signs at first. But over time, small clues began to add up. Late-night work meetings, unexplained absences, and a change in Mark's behavior. He was more distant, less attentive, and quick to brush off any questions Katy had. It wasn't long before she put the pieces together. Mark was having an affair. Although Katy realized what was happening, she didn't confront him right away. Instead, she kept her pain to herself, not wanting to add more tension to their already strained relationship. Deep down, she felt betrayed, not just by the affair itself, but by the hypocrisy. Here was Mark, the man who controlled every aspect of her life, yet he felt entitled to betray their marriage without consequence. Katy's growing awareness of the affair only made her feel more isolated and neglected. She was already emotionally distant from Mark, but now, the gap between them seemed unbridgeable. The man who demanded so much from her was giving his affection to someone else. Life for Katy had become a routine of quiet loneliness and emotional distance. But everything began to shift when a new neighbor, James, moved in next door. Unlike Mark, who was demanding and controlling, James was kind, thoughtful, and single. He had moved into the neighborhood to start fresh after his own personal struggles, and his easygoing nature quickly made him stand out. While Mark carried himself with a dominating presence, James was the opposite, gentle and considerate. He had a warm smile and a calm demeanor. It wasn't long before Katy and James struck up a casual friendship. Their first meeting happened by chance, as they both worked in their gardens on a sunny afternoon. Katy, often used to keeping to herself, found James's friendly approach welcoming. He spoke to her without any expectations, asking about her hobbies and showing a genuine interest in her as a person. These simple conversations soon became a regular part of Katy's day, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. As they spent more time together, Katy started to open up in ways she hadn't with anyone, especially not with Mark. James appreciated her sense of humor, her warmth, and her quiet intelligence. Unlike Mark, James allowed her to be herself. Their talks were easy, filled with light laughter and moments of understanding, and Katy found herself enjoying his company more and more. There was no denying that a connection was forming between them. It wasn't just the conversations or the shared smiles. It was the way James treated her, with respect and kindness. He never tried to control her or tell her what to do. Instead, he encouraged her to express herself, whether it was about her love of gardening, her thoughts on books, or her dreams of doing more with her life. For Katy, this was something she had been missing for so long. With James, she could breathe again, feel free to explore parts of herself that had been buried under Mark's control. The spark between them was subtle but undeniable. Katy wasn't looking for anything romantic, but the emotional connection was powerful. For the first time in a long while, she began to dream of a life beyond the walls of her marriage. And that thought, though unspoken, lingered in the back of her mind. James, too, began to feel a deep connection to Katy. He admired her strength, her kindness, and the quiet intelligence she carried with her. They confided in each other about their struggles. Katy spoke about the suffocating control Mark had over her life, while James opened up about his own past heartaches. However, as their connection grew stronger, it didn't go unnoticed. Mark, who had always prided himself on being in control, started to notice the way Katy and James interacted. At first, it seemed innocent, just neighbors being friendly. But soon, Mark became uneasy. He saw the way Katy smiled when she talked to James, the way they seemed to share inside jokes, and the lightness in her that had long been missing at home. Mark's controlling instincts kicked in. He didn't like the way Katy was changing, becoming more independent, more herself. He could sense that something was shifting, and his paranoia began to grow. At first, he didn't say anything. He simply watched from a distance, quietly observing their interactions. Every laugh they shared, Every glance Katy exchanged with James fueled Mark's suspicions. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and it gnawed at him. The more Mark watched, the more his jealousy grew. He started to interpret every moment Katy spent with James as a threat, though he had no concrete evidence that anything was happening between them. His suspicions, however, became an obsession. Instead of confronting Katy outright, Mark chose to silently stew, letting his paranoia fester, waiting for the right moment to act. Little did he know, this growing tension would soon reach a breaking point, setting off a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. It was a warm July evening when the neighborhood gathered for a casual party at one of the neighbors' homes. These gatherings were common in the community. Mark and Katy arrived together, as they always did, maintaining the appearance of the perfect couple. James, too, was there, mingling easily with the other neighbors, his natural friendliness making him a well-liked presence in the group. At first, everything seemed ordinary. People chatted in small groups, children ran around the yard, and laughter filled the air. But for Mark, something felt off. His eyes were constantly drawn to Katy and James. He noticed how they gravitated toward each other, standing close, sharing a laugh. To the other neighbors, it seemed like nothing more than friendly conversation. But for Mark, every look, every smile, every exchange felt loaded with meaning. His jealousy, already simmering for weeks, began to boil. Throughout the evening, Katy and James shared small moments that on the surface seemed innocent, passing each other drinks, exchanging quick smiles, or standing just a little too close during a conversation. These moments went unnoticed by most, but to Mark, they were filled with subtext. He could see the ease in Katy's body language around James, a lightness she never showed at home with him. It was the way she laughed at James's jokes, the way her eyes brightened when they spoke. It wasn't overt, but it was there, and Mark felt it like a slap. As the night wore on, the tension in Mark grew. Every time Katy and James were together, it felt like a betrayal, even if nothing inappropriate had happened. Mark could hardly focus on the conversations around him. His mind was consumed with watching them. His grip tightened around his drink as he observed from a distance, convinced that there was more between them than just neighborly friendliness. His suspicions fed his jealousy, twisting every gesture into something sinister. Katy, for her part, wasn't trying to provoke Mark. She felt safe with James, enjoying the freedom to be herself, something she rarely experienced with Mark. But she was aware of Mark's eyes on them, feeling his presence like a dark cloud hanging over the evening. She could sense his growing unease, but after years of living under his control, she no longer felt the need to shrink herself for his comfort. For once, she wanted to enjoy the company of someone who treated her with kindness. As the party continued, the tension between Mark and Katy was almost palpable. Mark's jealousy had reached a breaking point, though he kept it under a tight, simmering lid. He didn't cause a scene, but his mind was racing with the thought that he was losing control. Not just of Katy, but of the entire situation. The evening ended without incident, but the damage had already been done. What had started as quiet suspicion had now grown into something much darker, and Mark was determined to confront it. After the neighborhood party, the tension that had been building all evening finally came to a head. As Mark and Katy returned home, the silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. Once inside, Mark couldn't hold back any longer. His jealousy had reached a boiling point, and he was determined to confront Katy about what he had seen between her and James. Without warning, Mark erupted in anger. "What's going on between you and James?" he demanded, his voice sharp and cutting. His eyes were filled with suspicion, his usual calm demeanor shattered by jealousy and rage. Mark accused Katy of being too close to James, of flirting with him, of disrespecting their marriage. He couldn't believe that she had the nerve to act that way in front of him, to make him look like a fool. Katy, caught off guard at first, stood frozen as Mark's accusations poured out. But this time, something in her had changed. She had grown tired of living under Mark's control. tired of keeping quiet while he dictated every part of her life. His jealousy, his anger, it was too much. And in that moment, all the frustration she had been holding inside for years came rushing to the surface. With a calmness that surprised even her, Katy finally spoke up. "You're accusing me?" she said, her voice steady but firm. "You think I've been unfaithful? When all this time, you've been having an affair with Lisa?" Mark's face went pale. He hadn't expected this. For years, he had believed his secret affair was safely hidden, that Katy would never know or dare to confront him. But now, here she was, throwing it in his face. He tried to speak, but Katy cut him off, her voice rising with the years of pent-up resentment. "I've known for a long time, Mark," she said, her words sharp. "I've known about Lisa. I've kept quiet, just like you've always wanted. But not anymore. I'm done pretending. I'm done living by your rules." Mark stood there, stunned, as Katy continued. But it was her next words that truly pushed him over the edge. "If I want to have an affair, I will," she said coldly, her eyes locked on his. "Maybe I should. Maybe I deserve to be happy for once." Mark's face twisted with rage. He had always been the one in control, the one with the power in their marriage. But now, Katy's defiance felt like a direct threat to everything he had built. His jealousy turned into fury, and the idea of Katy being with someone else, especially James, was more than he could handle. The argument between Mark and Katy, which had begun with tense words and bitter accusations, quickly escalated into a scene of uncontrollable violence. In a sudden, violent fit of rage, Mark attacked Katy. His anger, fueled by jealousy and frustration, overtook him completely. Katy, shocked and desperate, tried to protect herself as Mark's fists came down. In the midst of their struggle, Katy stumbled backward. Her balance lost, she collided with the edge of a nearby table. The sharp corner struck the side of her head with a sickening thud. The force of the impact was enough to cause her to crumple to the floor, her body going limp. The argument, once heated and full of words, transformed into a moment of irreversible tragedy. Mark, immediately sensing that something had gone terribly wrong, stopped. The rage that had consumed him began to dissipate, replaced by a profound shock. He looked down at Katy, who lay motionless on the floor. Her face, once filled with anger and defiance, was now pale and lifeless. Mark's heart raced as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Panicking, Mark knelt beside Katy and shook her, desperately trying to wake her up. He called her name over and over, his voice trembling with fear and disbelief. But there was no response. Katy remained still, her body cold and unresponsive. The sight of her lifeless form made Mark's mind reel in horror. The full weight of his actions was hitting him now, and he realized, too late, the fatal consequences of his unchecked rage. Mark's attempts to revive Katy were futile. His hands, which moments ago were instruments of violence, were now useless. The gravity of the situation dawned on him with crushing clarity. Katy was gone, and nothing could undo the irreversible tragedy that had just occurred. The house, once filled with the echoes of their argument, was now silent, save for Mark's distraught cries and the faint sounds of the distant neighborhood. In those harrowing moments, Mark faced the devastating truth. His outburst had led to Katy's death, and with it, his entire world had crumbled. What began as a confrontation fueled by jealousy and resentment had ended in a tragic loss, leaving behind a scene of heartbreak and regret. The sudden and frightening commotion coming from the Williams home did not go unnoticed by the neighbors. Late that night, the sounds of a heated argument followed by a loud crash were enough to spark concern. Several neighbors, worried by the intensity of the noises, dialed 911. Their calls brought the police swiftly to the scene. When officers arrived, they were met with a distressing sight. Inside the Williams home, they found Katy's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, cold and motionless. Mark was found nearby, sitting in shock and disbelief, his hands trembling as he stared at Katy. The scene was chaotic and grim, filled with the weight of sudden tragedy. Mark was immediately taken into custody. The police, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, began their investigation. Their first step was to secure the crime scene and gather evidence. They interviewed the neighbors who had called them, each providing accounts of the argument they had heard and the distress they had observed. Their testimonies painted a picture of a violent confrontation, but the details were still unclear. The investigation quickly turned to Mark. His emotional state and the circumstances surrounding Katy's death were scrutinized. Mark's account of the night's events was examined closely. It became evident that his anger had spiraled out of control, leading to the fatal accident. His statements, combined with the physical evidence, pointed to his direct involvement in Katy's death. James, who had become an important figure in Katy's life, was also brought in for questioning. Given his close relationship with Katy in the days leading up to her death, the police needed to ensure he was not involved in any wrongdoing. James was questioned about his interactions with Katy, his whereabouts during the argument, and his relationship with her. Throughout the investigation, it became clear that James had no part in the tragedy beyond being a source of jealousy for Mark. His role was limited to being a witness to Katy's emotional state, but not to the violent incident that ended her life. As the investigation continued, the evidence gathered painted a clear picture of the sequence of events leading up to Katy's death. Mark's arrest was a critical moment, marking the beginning of a legal process that would seek to address the consequences of his actions. The focus shifted to understanding the depth of his guilt and the reasons behind the violent outburst that led to such a devastating outcome. The investigation revealed a tragic culmination of jealousy and control, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. In the wake of Katy's tragic death, the case against Mark Williams quickly became a focal point for local media. Charged with murder, Mark's trial captured the attention of the community and beyond. It was a dramatic and highly publicized event that unfolded in the local courthouse, with each development being closely followed by news outlets. Mark's defense team argued that Katy's death was a tragic accident. They contended that the fatal injury was not premeditated and sought to depict Mark as someone who had acted out of a moment of uncontrollable rage rather than intentional malice. They highlighted his shock and remorse following the incident, aiming to mitigate the severity of his actions. However, the prosecution painted a different picture. They presented evidence of Mark's controlling behavior, his affair with Lisa, and his violent tendencies as crucial factors leading up to Katy's death. They argued that the tragic outcome was the result of a long history of abuse and emotional manipulation, culminating in a violent outburst. The prosecution's case was built on the notion that Mark's actions were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that had culminated in murder. Mark was convicted of murder for 30 years, with parole eligibility after 17 years served. As Mark began his sentence, the community of Portland, Maine was left to reflect on the events that unfolded. The case served as a reminder that behind every story of domestic strife lies a complex web of emotions and behaviors that can have serious, sometimes fatal consequences. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, the town of Portland, Maine, remained haunted by the echoes of a tragedy that unfolded behind closed doors. Mark Williams, convicted of his wife Katy's murder, now faced the stark reality of his actions. The case, a chilling reminder of how unchecked jealousy and control can spiral into irreversible violence, left the community grappling with the unsettling truth of what transpired.